let's talk about marriage and the way we talk about marriage and think about marriage. Because we've done a terrible, terrible, terrible disservice to the institution of marriage in the way that we've addressed it from a policy standpoint. Does the Bible have anything to say about marriage? Does the New Testament have anything to say about homosexual activity? Is the fight for marriage over, and should we even care? Well, Jesus actually did. You hear this all the time. Jesus never spoke about homosexuality. Well, he spoke about marriage. And he said marriage is instituted in the Garden of Eden, man and woman, that's the way it's supposed to be. Matthew 19, 3 through 6. He most certainly did speak about it. Also, the Apostle Paul, who Jesus himself picked to be his mouthpiece, an apostle is a commissioned spokesperson, like a prophet, and he picked Paul, and Paul condemns homosexual activity, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, and 1 Timothy 1. Now, all that being said, we're still called to love everyone. And yes, you can love someone and disagree with them. In fact, that used to be the definition of tolerance, didn't it? I disagree with you, you disagree with me, but I believe in your right to believe what you want to believe. That used to be tolerance. And now that's gone out the window. So we are to love people, but loving does not mean always agreeing with them. Somebody came to you and said, I got a drug problem. Well, you need to stop. Quit disagreeing, quit loving me. You're not loving me. You should support my right to snort cocaine. No, I'm going to disagree with you, but I still love you. In fact, our disagreement is based in love. But people just go off the rails these days. But here's something you got to deal with. Should the state even be in the marriage business? It wasn't always. When I did my mom's genealogy a couple years ago, it was hard to trace some of it because back in eastern Kentucky and all throughout the prairie and the fields, if you wanted to get married, you went before the preacher. If the preacher said, you said, I do, and the preacher blessed it, you wrote your name in the family Bible, was married, and you were married, and there was no state license. You didn't go get a license. The federal government actually didn't get directly into the marriage business until the Revenue Act of 1913. There hasn't always been a license when it comes to marriage. So there are some arguing that perhaps the government just needs to get out of this business altogether. But when the government did get involved, why did the government get involved? This is something we've entirely missed in the marriage debate. Why did the government address marriage at all? Well, it addressed marriage because the federal government stated it had a compelling interest in making sure that children had a mother and father because study after study after study has shown children are healthier if they have a mother and a father. And it was to promote that, and that's the only reason the government got involved. But the true breakdown, actually, we can blame Ronald Reagan for this. Ronald Reagan became the first governor to sign no-fault divorce in 1969 in California. And the reason why divorce was so difficult to obtain before no-fault divorce was this government interest. They wanted to make divorce as difficult as possible to keep the mother and father together. That was the whole idea. But then a bunch of sociologists and child psychologists lobbied Ronald Reagan and said, yeah, but it's so traumatizing on the children. So we need no-fault divorce. So Reagan bought into that argument, signed a no-fault divorce. Guess what happened? Divorce rates skyrocketed. And when that happened, everything went off the rails. And once government began monkeying around with that, the gay rights community took hold of that and decided to push that way. Now, here's another thing we need to learn our history about. The so-called LGBTQ movement claims that its movement began in 1969 with the Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village. Now, there's even a movie about it, all that kind of stuff, Stonewall, so forth. The problem is it romanticizes it and it doesn't really tell the whole facts. Here's what really happened. The Stonewall Inn was a hangout for homosexual prostitutes and it was owned by the mob. And what would happen is the mob would push these gay prostitutes to try to seduce people of wealth or people in government positions so they could blackmail them. And so the police, when they raided the Stonewall Inn, were not harassing homosexuals. They were trying to break up a blackmail ring. And so the homosexual prostitutes resisted arrest. The police got a little rough with them. They did. But the police will tend to do that if you resist arrest with anyone. You're welcome to try it. See what happens. Enjoy that taser. Anyway, and so they resisted arrest. But this has been promoted by the media for decades as a significant event, and that this was just the police harassing homosexuals. That's not what happened. So the gay rights movements, though, basically it stalled. In the 70s and 80s, the gay rights movement got hardly any traction at all. They really didn't go anywhere. And so two Harvard grads, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen, wrote a book called After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear of Hatred of Gays in the 1990s. Sorry for the typo there. This book became the Bible of the LGBTQ community. It laid out the framework for what they would do. And then after a couple years, it was purposely put out of print. I have a copy of it. It cost me about $100. I've got it at home. And I got it when I worked for ADF because I would use it in my presentations. Here's what they argued. See if this sounds familiar. The book argued that homosexuals should do the following. 1, communicate, don't just express yourself. Be very articulate in how you talk. Learn to talk, especially to the media. That's 1. 2, appeal to skeptics. They said, avoid Christians and Catholics. Go for other folks, people who don't regularly attend church, so forth, and go after them. Start to build a majority. 3, keep talking, keep talking, keep talking, keep talking. And only about this issue. And they actually say, quit monkeying around with other issues. We don't want gay rights to become a liberal issue associated with other liberal issues. We want you to focus on it like a laser and talk about nothing but it. 4, again, keep the message focused on a handful of issues. 5, and this is where they lobby Hollywood, portray gays as victims of circumstance and oppression. That happened? Circumstance, that you were born that way and that you're persecuted. 6, give potential protectors a just cause. In other words, when you lobby skeptics, argue that I need you to help me protect me. Did that happen? Make gays look good and make victimizers look bad, especially in the media. Did that happen? This was a game plan they followed. And it worked very, very well. For example, one of the things in the book, they actually argue that their fellow homosexuals should stop looking like the village people. He said the fringes who like to dress in leather and all kind of stuff, stop. Put a suit on, look like the middle class. Said stop acting effeminate, act normal, and put on a game face. And they lobbied Hollywood to create characters based entirely off this book. Will and Grace sound familiar? It was a product of lobbying by the gay rights community. And it probably had more influence in our culture than the church has had. So now, Christians get the rep as these oppressors of homosexual activity. This is despite the fact that in our world today, ISIS executes homosexuals on the spot. And even when the Dalai Lama, a hero of Hollywood, a homosexual couple walked up to the Dalai Lama, and this is coming from a gay rights advocate in Chicago. So the couple walked up to Dalai Lama, asked him to bless their relationship. The Dalai Lama looked at him and said, holes are for procreation, and walked off. Now, if Pat Roberts had said that, could you believe the outcry? But when the Dalai Lama says it, he gets no coverage whatsoever. So if the purpose of government involvement in marriage is to promote healthy children raised by a mother and father, then the government endorsed same-sex marriage is totally unnecessary. You think about this. Why do you need same-sex marriage? What's the point? Now, some will argue, oh, they have to have hospital visitation rights. You designate your emergency contact yourself. And it doesn't have to be your spouse. Your will, contract, There are insurance programs out there open to anyone that you want to put on there as long as you're willing to pay for it. There's no government necessity. There's no, I mean, the government has no interest in affirming your relationship. You don't go get a license to have a best friend forever, your BFF. Right? So why do you need this? So there's a strong argument that if we're going to have no-fault divorce, if we're done promoting healthy kids, all that stuff, we just need to be out of the marriage business altogether and make it a religious institution. And go back to the pastor signing your old thing and you're done. Now, the call for same-sex marriage is actually nothing new. This is not a new kid on the block. The first suit for same-sex marriage was filed in 1971. A suit, Baker v. Nelson. It only became an issue when Hawaii there was a suit in Hawaii and some legislation that died in the Hawaii House of Representatives to recognize same-sex marriage. And so then, in 1996, Bill Clinton called for the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, and it was passed almost unanimously by Republicans and Democrats to define marriage as one man and one woman. It was not an issue. It did not become an issue until the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling in 2003, which most people don't understand this. There is a lot of money and primarily a single individual that was behind all this. There's a software developer, billionaire, by the name of Tim Gill in Colorado. He basically paid for that Massachusetts Supreme Court case. And then when the Massachusetts legislature decided to try to overrule by putting it on the ballot, letting people vote on it, and Massachusetts is heavily Catholic, and all the polls show that people were going to vote to overturn that Supreme Court case in Massachusetts. Tim Gill paid for lobbyists to go in and lobby the Massachusetts legislature, and Tim Gill basically said, I will pay for someone to run against you in the Democratic primary if you dare oppose me. And the issue died, and we've been living with it ever since. That's what actually happened. But the fight for marriage is not over, any more than the fight to protect unborn babies after Roe v. Wade was over. Just because the Supreme Court says it means nothing anymore, unfortunately. Because the Supreme Court has reversed itself several times. Brown versus Board of Education was overruling the earlier case of Plessy v. Ferguson. The Supreme Court reverses itself all the time. And so it can happen again. But you have to have people on the Supreme Court who actually believe in the Constitution. Any questions on that before we move on? What about other issues? Well, socialism has kind of had a rebirth lately, hasn't it? Probably it's more popular now than it has been since the 1930s. Some people claim the Bible endorses socialism? They point to Acts 2, 42 through 47, when the apostles and the early Christians all came together and they had everything in common. They were actually selling property and so forth to support the poor. Now, what's the problem with those verses supporting socialism? It was voluntarily done. The Christians came together voluntarily and shared their possessions. They were not forced by the government to do so. There's a big difference. And moreover, what they ignore is that by Acts, it did not last very long, because by Acts 6, the Hellenistic Jewish widows were saying, hey, when you're doling out the daily bread, we're not getting any. So that didn't last very long. And also, you got to understand this. And the father of modern socialism is Karl Marx. If you've never read Marx, you should. Communist Manifesto is not very long. I've read it. And Marx asserted that the central tenet of socialism is the abolition of private property. Is that biblical? What's the point of you shall not steal if everybody has everything in common? Why are you told not to covet your neighbor's possessions if you're not supposed to have possessions? Does that make any sense? The Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:28, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, that's work, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. So we are called to help the poor. There's no doubt about that. But we're supposed to do so voluntarily with our own money. Yeah. And that way God gets the glory. It's a way to share the gospel. Just voting in people who raid the treasury and other people's money, who gets the glory for that? God? No, the government does. So that's the problem. Furthermore, the problem with looking to the government to do everything is a fundamental misunderstanding of macroeconomics. Milton Friedman put it very simply this way, and you pick up his book, Free to Choose. Milton Friedman said, look, there are three kinds of purchases out there. Three kinds of ways you spend your money. First-party purchase, second-party purchase, third-party purchase. A first-party purchase is where you're buying something for yourself with your own money. So what do you care about? You care about price and you care about quality. And you're going to scrutinize both of those things, aren't you? A second-party purchase is you're purchasing with your own money something for someone else, like a gift. Well, now when it comes to quality, we have a tendency not to care as much as it was for ourselves, and we care a lot about price. A third-party purchase is when you're buying something for someone else with someone else's money. Here, you could care less about price or quality because it's not for you and it's not your money. Guess what? By definition, all government purchases are third-party purchases. This is why the Defense Department will pay $500 for a hammer. This is why government spending is always out of control. Because you have people buying stuff with our money that they're not going to directly use, so they don't care. It's inherently flawed. It's always going to be more expensive. It's never going to be as efficient as it should be, by definition. And furthermore, the government does a really bad job of it even when they blow the money. They're not effective. Lyndon Johnson is best known in 1965 for launching the war on poverty. Now, he announced that he believed that within 10 years, they could make poverty absolutely a thing of history, on the ash heap of history. How'd that work out? By 1980, Charles Murray, and you can read this in your own book, Losing Ground, he found that he used government statistics to show that after 15 years of the war on poverty, the poverty level was exactly the same. It was 13% in 1965, it was 13% in 1980. And we spent billions to keep it the same. Did not work. Socialism has also been the enemy of freedom, especially freedom of religion, and it typically only makes nations poorer. And making everybody poorer is not the way you help those in need. When China began to roll back its socialism and began to implement market reforms, within 10 years, they went from their number one problem being poverty and malnutrition to having a problem with obesity. Well, I'd rather have people fat than starving to death, wouldn't you? Any questions on poverty, government spending, and all that kind of stuff? I know we're at a 30,000-foot level, but I try to adhere to the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, because I'm stupid, so I have to keep it simple for myself. What about national defense? Should we have an army? Should we care about this? Shouldn't Christians adhere to the Sermon on the Mount and all be pacifists? The Amish believe this. The Amish deeply believe that we shouldn't fight. Well, Paul wrote government is authorized by God to bear the sword, Romans 13:40. And moreover, God commands his own people to go to war many times in the Old Testament, and God does not change. We have a tendency to see the God of the Old Testament as grumpy and angry, and then his hippie son comes along in the New Testament, says, chill out, and can't we all just get along, and let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. That's not true. I'm preaching this morning on hell. Guess who speaks about hell and judgment more than anyone else in the Bible? Jesus. And so this is not true. God does not change. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? Well, if you remember when I preached on the Sermon on the Mount, I've already talked about this. Jesus was not telling his people just to roll over It was a way to take a stand without fighting back against the Roman government, because that was going to be a bad idea, as the Jews found out in 66 AD when they rebelled and Jerusalem was leveled to the ground. So Jesus was telling how to take a stand without ratcheting things up. Well, the theologian Augustine spent a lot of time thinking about this, and Augustine came up with what I think is a biblical position, which is called the just war theory. Augustine basically said, okay, Jesus was basically saying that you need to stand up for yourself without fighting back on a one-on-one kind of thing. So somebody gives you an insult, you don't have to lob insult back at them. You can just walk away. That you need as an individual to be that way. But Augustine said, but when nations go to war, that's different. That's different. And he says, so his just war theory, looking at all the Bible, he said, the nation going to war must have a just cause. It must be a competent authority declaring the war. In other words, it has to be a government it can't be, by a dictator or something like that. There has to be comparative justice. That means the enemy's actions are immoral and the one declaring war has good intention. So what he's saying is, it's not if we had gone to war with Nazi Germany so that we could take Germany and keep it, he would say that's not comparative justice. But to go and defeat the Nazis and then hand them their country back and have a free Germany, he said that would be fine. And finally, war is the last resort, and finally there is a probability of success. That's Augustine's just war theory. And this has been held up by theologians for about 1,500 years now. I think he's right. Makes sense? Any questions on that? So in other words, if somebody just, gives you the finger driving through New Boston, don't retaliate. Then you're upholding the Sermon on the Mount. Just, hey, number one. What about the environment? Don't we have a responsibility to care for the earth God created and pronounce good? In fact, he pronounced it very good. Well, I think we do. But let's be careful here. God also commanded humankind to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. God created the resources that we need to live, and I think he created them so that we could live. And the better we can utilize those resources, the fewer people we will have in need. Does that make sense? And we talked about this when we talked about in the first week that federal regulatory policy is out of control. You're talking about 80,000 pages of federal regulations today, which nobody can understand or follow. They often contradict itself. One study found that the average businessman commits 3 felonies a year and has no idea he's committed them. That most regulatory lawyers can't tell you if you're breaking the law, because who can memorize 80,000 pages of federal regulation? Nobody can. And the Environmental Protection Agency is one of the worst. For example, in the state of California, water in the San Joaquin Valley that farmers used was diverted to the Pacific Ocean to save a 3-inch fish called the Delta smelt. Farmers went out of business. Businesses relied on the farmers, went out of business. Unemployment hit 40% in the San Joaquin Valley after that was done. Does that sound like subdue the earth and have dominion over it? We're being ruled by a 3-inch Delta smelt. Anybody go fishing for Delta smelt? Yeah, oh yeah, owls. I mean, it's unreal. And so we have these people arguing, well, they're necessary for the biosphere. No, they're not.
Stuff's been going extinct.
Yeah, people have been going extinct. Yeah, I mean, how many, goodness sakes, did the biosphere just absolutely go crazy when the dinosaurs went extinct? No. I mean, it's just nutty. It's just.
There weren't SUVs.
Yeah, exactly. There's also a movement to destroy companies like Monsanto. You've seen this, especially on Facebook, for making frankenfoods. These are genetically modified foods. Now, to be honest, there are some studies out there that show that people are healthier if they stick to an organic, natural diet. and that some genetically modified foods contain some chemicals in them that produce an overabundance of estrogen that, especially in men over 40, give you belly fat. Okay, that's true. But, that being said, these genetically modified foods can grow in harsh environments, and because of them, they have cut the hunger rate around the world by double digits. Now again, I'd rather have someone in Africa or India with a little belly fat than starving to death. Wouldn't you? And so this whole push to outlaw this stuff is crazy because it would starve people to death. It would starve people to death.
Plus it keeps the food price down.
Exactly. Can anybody afford to live off purely organic food? There's no way. You know, I wish I could. I wish I had that much money. I would, but I can't. And there's no reason. Let me tell you something. I'm studying to be a fitness trainer. So let me just put this on the table. There is no reason to have an organic banana. It provides no health benefits at all. Because pesticides and so forth cannot penetrate a banana peel. And so if that's what you're worried about, what difference does it make? It doesn't make any difference. And quite frankly, you can wash off most pesticides with a little, I used to have this goop that I put together. You put together a couple things, household products, some baking powder, some other things, and you can scrub the fruit, and if it's non-organic, pesticides are gone, almost completely gone. And by the way, most pesticides are in the air and the water anyway, and you can't avoid it. There are trace amounts of antidepressants in all of our drinking water, so that's why we're all happier, right? I guess. That's because so many people flush them down the toilet. They end up in the water supply. What about the death penalty? There are a lot of good Christians out there who argue there should be no death penalty. And I have done death penalty cases, and let me tell you, the system is not perfect. I represented a young man I think had no business going to death, and he was sentenced to death. When I was in law school, I did a case where a young man he was basically an accessory. But Bill Clinton actually passed a law that says that if you are an individual associated in any direct way with a carjacking that results in death, even by accident, you will be put to death. As Bill Clinton signed that into law. And so there are serious problems with the system. I mean, you have to understand this. If you have the death penalty on the table, there are actually two trials. There is the guilt phase, and then there's the penalty phase. So if you're found guilty, you then have to have a separate trial where the jury determines whether or not to give you death or life in prison. And the case I did in South Carolina, they only took 4 hours to give my client death. And when one of the jurors was polled, they said, well, who cares if he did it or not, he's white trash. Okay, so there's some problems there. Now, there's a long and lengthy appeal process. I understand that. There are problems with it. But I cannot in any way, shape, or form argue that the death penalty is unbiblical. God instituted the death penalty in Numbers 35. And I think it's a fair assessment of looking at Romans 13, 1 through 7, that Paul agreed with the death penalty, even though, ironically, Paul was killed by the empire. He was beheaded as a traitor. This would be a favorite of George back there. What about gun control? As I know one of George Crumb's favorite verses, when Jesus says, go buy a sword. That's probably the one verse George has memorized on the tip of his tongue all the time. 22:36. See? I knew it. I knew it. Well, what about the Sermon on the Mount? How do you balance owning a gun to defend yourself with the Sermon on the Mount? Now, even the gun control whack jaws, most of them, don't argue that we should ban all guns. Even, Clinton, Sanders, in fact, Sanders actually had a pretty high rating at one time with the NRA. Because up in Vermont, as liberal as they are, they like to hunt. and you're not going to take their guns away from them. And so it's a sportsman's paradise up there. And so, but it comes down to guns for self-defense. And how do you square that with the Sermon on the Mount? Well, as George pointed out, Jesus himself said to go buy a sword and have a sword. Peter had a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. Swords were carried for personal protection in the ancient Near East. They were not tools. They did not have guns, so you carried a sword. That's right. In place of a Glock, you had a sword. That's right. And so that's what they're doing. So again, when Jesus is talking about turning the other cheek, one, it's been misunderstood because it's actually a form of protest. Two, it's proverbial, and you can take it too far because you've got to harmonize this with, because the Father, Son, and Spirit are always in agreement. And in the Old Testament, God, again and again and again, whether it's Joshua, whether it's David, whether it's, go get them, he says. Now,
They were offensive, not defensive a lot of times.
yeah, they could be, but primarily in the Roman Empire, you carried them so if there weren't soldiers around, because they're often bandits.
So I mean, in the Old Testament.
Yeah, in the Old Testament, they often used, it's actually really cool, most Israelites fought with ox goads. And ox goads were these really long things. You use them to herd cattle and so forth, but they had a sharp end on them. And they could be 5 to 7 feet long, and it had a hook at the end of it. You could really go to business on somebody. I mean, you could stand far back and jab them. And so, yeah, they were nasty weapons. But moreover, gun control laws just typically don't work. I lived in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has very strict gun control laws. My brother's roommate had an arsenal in his closet, but they were all illegal because he'd have to go out of state, buy them, and bring them back in the trunk of his car because it was too hard to buy a gun in California. And it took forever. And the taxes were high and all kind of stuff. And machine guns were illegal. And yet you get anywhere near South Central Los Angeles on a Friday or Saturday night, guess what you hear? Rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat, pop, 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 pop. You hear AK-47s going off. And Chicago has strict gun control laws. How's that working out? It's one of the murder capitals of the world. Because guns are sold on the underground all the time. Heck, you can go online, go on YouTube right now or Google, and you can find how to build a zip gun yourself. It's an absolutely just fantasy that you can just issue a ban and then no one's going to have a gun. It's not going to happen. And what are they going to do? They're going to go door to door and raid your closets? I don't think so. Now, that being said, and the Second Amendment also I think is very clear, but being biblical, I don't think having a gun for self-protection conflicts in any way with the Sermon on the Mount. Moreover, home defense experts say the most effective way to deter if somebody's trying to break into your house, you don't necessarily have to shoot them. I hope you don't. But you rack a shotgun, just that sound usually will send them running.
My mother did that by loading a rifle in the window.
Yeah, typically that's all you have to do. Is if you rack a shotgun, most people will get going. And so, and more than that, in states that have concealed carry laws, which Ohio actually has open carry as well, concealed carry laws, murder rates have dropped 8.5% since concealed carry was instituted. Rape is down 5% and assaults are down 7%. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So at the end of the day, this is going to be our last class. I have to be in Virginia next weekend for a thing. So we'll wrap up this and we'll kick off with another class in January on apologetics, returning to Christian apologetics. And I'm going to deal with some of the tough texts in the Bible, some of the hardest verses to understand. We'll deal with that come January. But I want you to know this. There are a couple books, if you're interested in this. Wayne Grudem has written the most comprehensive politics according to the Bible. Marriage, there's a book called Same-Sex Marriage by John Stone Street and Sean McDowell that's very good. On abortion, there's a book called The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf that's very, very good. On the Constitution, the Heritage Guide to the Constitution is actually online for free. And so you can go on, you can buy the book, I've got it, but you can also just go online. Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell is a big book, but it's very easy to read. And so you can read these things, and these folks often will cite Scripture. Of course, Grudem always, in his Politics According to the Bible, cites Scripture all the way through. And that's where I'm getting a lot of this, though not all of it. But keep in mind, the LGBTQ community, they were very smart in how they did. From 1989 on, they were very smart, very focused, very patient. Christians, on the other hand, conservative Christians, have been very impatient, unfocused, and dumb. It's not enough to say, I know what's right, and scream it at the top of your lungs. If somebody doesn't believe the Bible, quoting a Bible verse at them does nothing. You have to convince them. So what do you do with marriage? Well, studies show, including a study from the University of Texas, though it was widely attacked for political reasons, studies at the University of Texas found, guess what? Healthiest children are raised in a home by a mother and father. And if the government's not promoting that by promoting traditional marriage, then it probably has no business in the marriage business at all. On the case for life. Well, you don't know when life begins. That's above my pay grade. Well, if you don't know when life begins, what's the safest option to take?
Nothing.
Preserve it. Assume that it is. Is that the safest? It goes back to when I was talking about this last week. If I'm out hunting and I hear something rustle behind a bush, I just assume that it's a turkey or something, and I shoot, it turns out to be a person, guess what? I'm guilty of manslaughter. I can go to jail, and should. So even if you can't prove that life begins at conception, I think you have to assume it because you can't prove the inverse. The Constitution was written by a bunch of old, dead, white bigots. All true. Has nothing to do with what they knew about government. Has nothing to do with it. So what? You can be old white bigot, and if you say 2 + 2 = 4, doesn't mean you're wrong just because you're an old white bigot. It has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with whether you're right or wrong. And these are things you need to keep in mind. And finally, you've got to be, again, go back to what I started with this class. Christians have to be smarter. My friends who are Trump supporters, most polls say that he has about a 10% chance of winning the election, or less. Just because the Electoral College map, just because this is the way it is. There were 3 other Republican candidates who were running who would be beating Hillary by double digits right now, according to polls. Stupid, stupid, stupid. We may have blown the Supreme Court for decades. Dumb, dumb, dumb. Be smart. Even if you don't like a particular, well, he's a squish, he's a rhino. Can he win, and will he further the conservative agenda? We don't have to have a touchdown every play. 3 yards at a time, 3 yards at a time, 3 yards at a time, and you're winning. But when you try to throw Hail Marys all the time and demand everything be done overnight, you're just going to lose, 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 lose. I will open up the border to all of Mexico if I can get Roe v. Wade overturned, because it's more important. Just don't care. It's more important. You have to prioritize. And for the first time in decades, the majority of Americans polled are pro-life. This would have been the time to make our move. And we may have blown it. We may have completely blown it. We have to be smarter. Be smart. Don't care if it's a squish, rhino, whatever, which those are all new terms, and it's kind of stupid. Because by definition, when I listen to people talk, when they call someone a rhino, Ronald Reagan would qualify.
What is a rhino?
A Republican in name only.
Oh, okay.
A moderate, a squish. Well, Reagan raised taxes a couple times. Reagan compromised the Democrats on Social Security. Did not. Reagan gave amnesty to a lot of people. They call him a squish.
Squish.
Yeah, a moderate, not reliable.
Okay.
And he's the most conservative president in American history, other than maybe Calvin Coolidge. And so folks, the majority of Americans polled are not conservative. They're not. The majority actually will tell you they're just kind of both. They have some views over here, they have some views over here, and you have to win them to win an election. That's the way it is. Not everybody's like us. I wish they were. It'd be great if 100% of Americans were evangelical Christians, and that's my goal. But we're about 88% away from that. So you can't rely on that. You've got to be smart. Any questions, comments before we quit? We've got 3 minutes. And I'm going to get caffeined and sugared up so I can go preach on hell. If I haven't made enough people angry already, I'll see what I can do by the end of the day.
I thought you were talking about heaven.
Yeah, well. Any questions, comments? All right. Well, let's close in prayer and we'll get out of here. Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you that we still have the freedom to come together and to worship and serve you. I pray that everyone does that. What's more important than what happens in Washington, D.C. is what happens when Christians reach out in love with the gospel and try to bring people into a saving relationship with you. We get awfully ginned up about politics. I wish we put that same energy and passion into sharing the gospel and to living to honor and glorify you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, folks.
Christ Community meets on Saturday at 5 p.m. and Sunday at 10:30 a.m. For more information, visit www.christcommunity.net or check out our Facebook page.